So my paper is going to be somewhat different in terms of the approach I'm taking, as well as the way I'm trying to understand Islamophobia, going beyond exclusion, discrimination, to actually look at how the constitution of what it means to be human is actually changing through the Islamophobic discourse that's so pervasive today. So it's going to be very different in tone. Also, I'm going to be doing a kind of textual analysis of film. So, it will sit a bit uneasily with the presentations that you've heard so far, but hopefully it will be very interesting to you. Okay, so I'll just begin with a brief kind of summary of my paper. Women in the US and other allied Western societies have played an unprecedented role in the war on terror, turning it into a field of opportunities for their socio-political advancement. The commitment to gender and sexual egalitarianism that facilitates such advancement is now widely accepted as a unique Western cultural value in relation to which Islam is defined as irremediably misogynist. Now, as many scholars have argued, gender has become central to the discourse of Islamophobia. The success of this claim of gender and sexual egalitarianism being a unique Western trait, the success of this claim is reliant on feminist endorsements that further, I argue, the demonization of Islam and believing Muslims, men and women, even as they facilitate the incorporation of feminism, not just the deeper integration of women into the imperialist politics of the 21st century. So that gives you a sense of the kind of arguments I'm going to be building. So in this paper, I ask two main questions. How have feminists engaged with the hegemonic constructs of the perversity and the monstrosity of Islam as the civilizational enemy of the West? And what role do feminists play in the expenditure of violence against what is defined as the religiously inspired evil of believing Muslims? So my aim in asking these two questions is to study the engagements of prominent feminists, both white Western as well as Muslim feminists, with the civilizational mission that is the West, inaugurated in its latest incarnation by the war on terror. Although the initial instructions, I'm actually beginning the text of my paper now, although the initial instructions to US forces to get, quote, bin Laden, dead or alive, came from President Bush, it was President Obama who, transfixing his chair in the White House, along with the rest of his team, including Hillary Clinton, oversaw bin Laden's assassination. The trophy photograph released by the administration reveals the intense fascination, horror, and dread tinged with disbelief that's marked indelibly on these anxious faces as they witness this macabre private screening of the reality show unfolding in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The killing of bin Laden, US Attorney General Eric Holder was quick to reassure the world, was in keeping with, quote, US law and values. So I want to think about what these law and values are. Bin Laden's murder was thus pronounced to be within the bounds of law and cause for celebration by civilized peoples committed to the defense of Western values. On Fox News Network, Glenn Beck thanked the US Army on behalf of the American people under the banner headline, Osama bin Laden, Muslim monster, killed. The believing Muslim as potential terrorist is deemed devoid of ethics and morality within the ideological frame of the war on terror, incapable of anything other than murderous envy of the West and irrepressible hatred of women. The turban, the AK-47, and the flowing beard are among the signs that mark out the Muslim male as perverse, a contemporary figure of monstrosity. Now, Jasbir Kaur has written about it, as well Amit Rai, amongst others. As for his companion, the Muslim woman, her veiled face is said to mask her fanatic nature, capable of vengeful eruption in the diabolical guise of the Black Widow or the sexually frustrated suicide bomber. Indeed, popular depictions of Muslims, Islamists in particular, routinely portray them as barbaric and monstrous. This Muslim enemy is considered human only upon his transformation into the popularly subjugated supplicant to Western power as she comes to subscribe to its superior norms and values particularly with regard to gender and sexual norms. As for the resisting Muslim, her deadly propensity for violence and fanatic religiosity mark him or her out for elimination. Feminists have long defined war, terror, and torture as a largely masculinist enterprise. But Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay have complicated such claims about the workings of patriarchy. Moreover, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay also undermine feminist theorizing of abjection and monstrosity as tied to the female body within the symbolic order. Indeed, the prisons and torture centers of the war on terror reveal the complexities and the sexual and racial politics engaged in the contemporary production of the Muslim body, male and female, as a site of the monstrous. As Muslim men were smeared in the menstrual blood and other excrements that feminists claim signify sexual difference, these male bodies were turned into the sign of a monstrous masculinity by female prison guards and intelligence officers who defined themselves as defenders of the Western civilized order and proof of its emancipatory gender politics. In these torture centers, it was a white woman who covered Muslim men's faces with women's underwear and made the prisoners wear dog collars and crawl on the ground. As they broke Muslim male bodies under torture and turned them into the sign of abjection, defilement, and pollution, these women, I argue, upheld the phallic power of the West. Abjection and monstrosity, it turns out, center on the racially charged politics of the sexual dramas of the West. The naked Muslim men and the Muslim corpses turned props in the photographs taken by and of the white women and men, clearly exulting in their racial pleasures, stand testimony to the powerful desires and fantasies of the women involved in these encounters. The evil filth of the Orient, evident in the excrement smeared on the naked Muslim male bodies, humiliated and ashamed, stands in sharp contrast to the sterile cleanliness and casual mastery of the white women and men in charge of the scenes being shot. The power of white women in these sites was such that they could penetrate black, brown, male Muslim bodies, proof of which was documented by the gaze of the camera. In her choice to be equal of the white men, here stood the white woman, with access to the power to penetrate, possess, and destroy the male Muslim bodies on display. Transgressing the borders between the human, i.e. the westernized American body, and the non-human, i.e. the evil filth that is the Muslim body in this site, to descend into the nightmare world of Abu Ghraib in order to protect Western civilization, white women were critical to the redrawing of the lines between the civilized bodies, who have to resort to violence, even if in entirely unseemly ways, and the bestial, the Muslim male bodies who remain abject. From this descent into hell, the American women soldiers, guards, intelligence officers, mercenaries, etc. have emerged as heroic. Even anti-war activists are among those careful to state their unconditional support for, quote, our troops, seen as perhaps having been pushed too far into doing evil by the evil that is the Muslim enemy. So I'm going to kind of skip over the theoretical frame that I have for my paper because that will take too much time, but I'll give you a general kind of idea of the kind of theoretical framework that I'm using. So I begin with an examination of how feminists have theorized the fantasy desires that are articulated in the monster genre of popular films and popular culture. Here I argue that by identifying sexual difference as singularly constitutive of the monstrous, and I'm thinking here, I begin with Barbara Creed's work on the monstrous feminine. Some of you might be aware of her. She's been a very, very major figure in feminist film theory. So I argue that by identifying sexual difference as singularly constitutive of the monstrous, feminists have obscured the raciality that is central to the sexualization of the figure of the monster within the Western philosophical, legal, and political psychoanalytic traditions. Such a lighting reveals feminism's own fraught fantasy desire for the racially monstrous. Moreover, feminists fuel the paranoia generated by such racial phantasms by inflecting these with gendered and sexualized modalities of violence, thus reinforcing the demonization of the racially monstrous, defining woman as the real target of the aggression of the monstrous enemy. Feminists have inserted themselves as the doubled victim and heroine in the Western sexual political imaginary. So what I do here is I look at how feminists have drawn on the psychoanalytic tradition to argue using a Freudian theory of castration anxiety, that in this monstrous genre of films, the fear that's being expressed, this is Barbara Creed's argument, is that Freud's castration theory, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that, the theory of the young boy seeing the woman's vagina and interpreting that as her having been mutilated and being castrated, and then having a fear himself of being likewise castrated. Creed's argument is that in the monster genre, the woman is recognized as not castrated figure, but as the castrating figure. And where the monster genre of films has been read before feminist film theory's intervention as a fight between the evil, or between the powers of evil and good, she is actually arguing that the epic battle that's taking place in this monster genre of films is actually the fight between the masculine and the feminine. And the feminine is the figure of the monstrosity, and hence her title of her book, The Monstrous Feminine. So she's arguing, she also draws on Kristeva's theory of abjection to look at how women's body is turned into the site of abjection as marking both the body that is pure and impure, as well as the boundary between the human and inhuman. So women's bodies leaking blood, menstrual blood, has been central to the feminist theorization of abjection as a kind of feminine body and tied to the figure of the monstrous, against which the white male masculine body is fully human. Okay? So these are the two kind of theoretical engagements that I'm taking up in my paper. But because I don't have a lot of time to do a kind of theoretical critique of them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at two film texts. Now these have not been produced by white feminist filmmakers. They've actually been produced by Muslim filmmakers. But both of them center feminism as the kind of terrain on which these films are being read. And I want to discuss a couple of scenes that give you a kind of sense of how I'm reading these texts as contributing to the Islamophobic construct of the Muslim body, both male and female, as the site of the monstrous. Okay, and for me, my interest is in tracking Islamophobia at the core of this kind of construct of what it means to be human and who is human. So, I want to talk about two feature films here. One is Kandahar, which was made by Mahmal Baf, but Niloufar Pazira, who is an Afghan-Canadian journalist who wrote the script for the film and actually features in the film. Okay, so one is Kandahar. She then subsequently made a documentary, Return to Kandahar, where she goes back on the same project that I'll describe here. And the second film that I'll talk about is Osama. So Kandahar is, as I said, produced by Muslim journalists, filmmakers, about the status of women in Afghanistan during the Taliban regime and shortly after the occupation of Afghanistan by the US-led coalition. Now this film is very important because George Bush actually asked to have it screened before he launched the war on terror in order to understand Afghanistan and the kind of culture of Afghanistan. So this film has been circulated, you know, in very, very high places. So they have also, both films, Osama and Kandahar, have received a lot of international attention and acclaim, most particularly from human rights, feminist, and NGO communities. So I've discussed these films somewhere elsewhere as well. So I'll just give you a kind of brief synopsis of Kandahar first, which is a feature film defined also as a quasi-documentary, and it's based on the experience of the Afghan-Canadian journalist Niloufar Pazira. cast as the heroine Nafas in what is basically a film about a feminist search and rescue mission. The film traces Fazira's travails in Afghanistan as she sets out to recover her sister, who was inexplicably left behind as the family fled the country after the Soviet withdrawal. Nafas Fazira has received a letter from the sister who states her intention to kill herself at the last lunar eclipse of the 20th century. Life is unbearable under the Taliban, the letter says. Death is the only release. With the eclipse fast approaching, Fazira Nafas sets out for Kandahar to save her sister, encountering numerous obstacles along the way. The film ends with Nafas Fazira still trying to reach Kandahar, the outline of the city visible in the distant horizon. She hasn't been able to reach her sister, she hasn't been able to save her sister, and that is where the documentary starts, when she takes another trip to try and save the sister. Now, the scene from Kandahar that I wish to discuss here depicts an incident that occurs soon after Fazira enters Afghanistan via Iran. Leaving behind the Afghan family with whom she's been traveling after they are robbed by Taliban-style bandits, Fazira continues her journey with a young Afghan boy as her guide. The boy loses no opportunity to defraud her, and Nafas Fazira can barely contain her contempt for him. As she sets out with him, she speaks into the tape recorder that she carries with her all the time. And in this film, it's never clear where the sisterly rescue mission ends and the journalist feminist adventure begins. In this tape recorder, she's constantly describing her experiences and perspectives. So she records how she has been surrounded by violence wherever she goes in Afghanistan. I want to quote her. She says, "Even in the children's games, along my journey, everything is at war." 2 minutes? Okay. Dog fights dog, bird fights bird, human fights human. In the chain of signification she sets up, the perversity of the fighting dogs morph into that of fighting birds, coming to rest in the fighting of the Muslim children, dogs as human who disgust her. Although of Afghan origin herself, Fazira's revulsion at all things Afghan, I argue, reassures the audience, and presumably herself, of her own difference from these people, animals really, among whom she finds herself. In other words, using her status as a sometime Afghan to reassure her audience that she really knows how grotesque is the nature of Afghan Muslims, she confirms for them what they already know about the Muslim world. In this way, Fazira's adventures become the telling of truths that are always already known by the westernized subject. The full measure of the grotesqueness of the Afghan Muslim is revealed in the form of a young boy, a child really, whom Fazira has convinced to take her to Kandahar. As the two walk along the barren, lifeless landscape that is presented as the real Afghanistan, they come upon a skeleton. Nafas Fazira flees in horror, but the boy goes up to the skeleton and removes a ring from its finger. He then badgers Nafas Fazira to buy the ring he has retrieved from the skeleton. Fazira's revulsion towards the boy, the skeleton, and the ring merge and thus become more palpable. Here, the living prey on the dead in a zone devoid of life and morality. The dead reveal the monstrosity of the undead, the young boy. The young boy ghoulishly pillaging the spoils of a rotting skeleton in this economy of death and decay functions as a sign of evil. The evil that is his dead spirit, his dead world, his wretched country, and his thieving people, Muslims. Destructive of all morality, this economy of death is inhospitable to the living, represented here by Nafas Fazira in her status as outsider, in her Canadianness, because she is a Canadian Afghan, she never loses an opportunity to remind the audience of this, and her westernization. This scene gives rise to no reflection on a poverty and destitution so desperate that the robbing of corpses, the hiring out of children to the Western feminists who have come with the invading Western forces becomes the only means of survival. Such a reflection might question the calculations of an intrepid heroine in her making of a film that exploits the friendship and death of a sister, or of the power of the US dollars that she carries with her and hands out to the destitute natives, not in compassion, not in solidarity, not even in exchange for services rendered by them, but as the means to reveal their venality. So I have to stop now. I have a much more interesting paper to present.